Cila Drucker. Today's date is August 8th, 1996.
Well, when we were liberated, as I said, I lived with Marta and her husband Lajos Dele in one room, and I decided to stay there for a while and look for a job. There was a family of Dr. Fried, whose wife was German, not Jewish, who saved him during the war, and he was a physician. When the Russian army came in, he went with the army, and she was left alone with a child who had Down syndrome. So it was decided that I move in with them, and I will be her translator in case a Russian comes to the door and she only speaks German, and they'll shoot her without asking questions, and I'll look after the boy. So that's what we did. I moved in there, and she taught me a lot about cooking and music, and one day on the street I met somebody from our town who told me that my uncle Ian, my father's younger brother, came back from Russia and was living in Warsaw, working for the Ministry of Interior. He was in charge of the German prisoners. I wrote to him, and he wrote me that my father was alive in Russia and gave me his address. So I started corresponding with my father, and I still remember when I got the first letter from him. The title was like this long: "My dearest, sweetest, or blah 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 daughter," and I was crying. I really couldn't even read it. And he sent me some money, and he also asked me if I would be willing to come and live in Russia, as he realized that nobody was alive, and he had a good job there, a good life. He was running a kolkhoz, and I of course said I would go to live with him anywhere, as long as we are together. So he asked the authorities for permission to bring me over, and he was informed that it will take 3 years. The Russian bureaucracy saved me. Otherwise I would have been living in Russia trying to get out by now. So he decided to come back to Poland. He came to Poland. He went to our hometown, tried to sell some property, a house that belonged to my grandfather, which he did for $500, and tried to recover some mementos from our home. Supposedly he went to one house where he saw our oil painting on the wall, and he asked about it, and he was told they don't have it. So he turned away and he left, because there were cases where they killed you in the back when you came to ask for something. And he also decided, or maybe whilst we were corresponding, we decided that we are not going to live in Poland anymore. Whilst all this was happening, it took him a while to, first of all, it takes you ages to come through from somewhere, the Ural or the Sibir, where he was, across Russia to Poland. I left Mrs. Fried's household, and I went to work for a home that was turned into a sanatorium supported by the UNRWA, where they brought the children that survived the Theresienstadt to recuperate. And I was a counselor. I had boys from 11 to 13, which was a terrible age to manage, where I was only 17, 18. But there was also a little girl who must have been in a shock. She was maybe 5 or 6. She didn't talk at all. She reminded me so much of my sister that even though she wasn't under my care, I sort of gravitated towards her, and she responded to me. She didn't let anybody feed her except me. And I don't remember if she started talking to me, but she would follow me and sort of feel my interest in her because of who she reminded me of.
Do you remember her name?
I don't remember her name. I have a picture of her somewhere in my album. And then one day, out of the blue sky, Mr. Grajover from Liptovsky Svati Mikulash arrived. He and his wife survived in Terezin. And I don't know how he found out where I was, but he came and insisted that I go back with him to Moravska Ostrava, where they now lived, and that my father finds me in his house. He wants to be the good person, I suppose, that helped me survive. And being a very young person, I always did what the elders told me. So I left the home where I was working, and I went with him to Moravska Ostrava, and I let my uncle or my father know where I was. During all this, I also went to Warsaw for a week to visit my uncle before my father came. I never went back to Mielec. I never had the desire. I still don't. I can't see myself walking the ghost town where there is nobody alive. I went to Warsaw, and on the border, when the Polish crew came on, the Czech crew left, and the Polish crew came on, and they started speaking Polish, my thought was, what a strange language. Another disassociation. I stayed a week in Warsaw with my uncle, and I went back. And I waited for my father. And he met me in Ostrava, and I think it was a shock for both of us. He left an 11-year-old child, and he met a young woman in a black dress with lipstick. I thought I have a tall father, because I was little, and I realized he wasn't so tall. And we were estranged. We weren't like a normal daughter and father. And we decided then, somehow he, through a friend, decided to move to Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary. By then he spoke Russian, and there was some kind of a Russian business that required his services. And we moved to Karlsbad. He took the job, and I was a housewife, a house girl, daughter, or whatever, running his household, and making friends, going out with boys the first time in my life.
What had he been doing during the war? Where was he?
During the war, he was caught in Lemberg, and the Russians collected many Jews in Lemberg, Lvov, and took them to they considered them enemies. They took them to Russia, deep in Russia, some to Siberia, some to somewhere else. My father was somewhere in Kazakhstan and Alma-Ata and all kinds of Russian camps. But he was a very unusual person. Wherever he was, whether it be in the army, he immediately was in the office doing paperwork. In Russia, they took them to a forest to cut timber. And he was cutting timber, and then he saw them at the end of the day trying to measure how much timber they cut. And he saw that they have no idea how to do it. So he volunteered, and he taught them how to put it in a square blocks, and then you measure the block, and you figure out how much you cut. So he was immediately in charge of the whole brigade. Then he kept moving from one job to another till he came to a commune, a kolkhoz, and he was in charge of it. And he helped a lot of other people, taking them into their commune and giving them lighter jobs and giving them bread, and because many of them starved and were sick and didn't have what to eat. So he, in comparison to other people, have quite a good life, and that's why he wanted to stay there.
Did your relationship with him become more normal?
It became more normal, but again, we were separated after a few years living in Czechoslovakia. Then in Israel, I moved to Canada. But he wasn't a very demonstrative person. He did hug me and kiss me and tell me how much he loved me in one way, but then he got married. And he was more of a husband than a father. But again, I was a grown-up and I didn't really need a father. But I don't think it was as close as it would have been had we not been apart.
So let's go back to a bit of the history. So what happened?
So we lived in Carlsbad, and he was working, and as I said, I tried to live a normal life. My regret is that he didn't force me to go back to school. I suppose that maybe he suggested it and I refused because I missed living and I just wanted to live and have a good time. But him being older, he should have known better and forced me to go to school and get, because my great regret in life is that I didn't get a formal education. I could have been a professional or anything. I really wanted to be a doctor when I was a child, maybe because of that doctor neighbor that we had living on the same floor, Dr. Kaufman. And one day a lady arrived by the name of Sarah Forshim, who knew him when they were children in Poland. Somebody mentioned that maybe she was in love with my father when they were young, and when he got married, she left for Palestine. She had a large family in Poland, and some of her sisters survived, some in Russia, some in hiding under false papers. And she wanted to go and visit them in Poland, but the Polish government wouldn't give visas to Jews from Palestine already after the war. But the Czech government did. So my father got her a visa to come to Carlsbad, and somehow from Carlsbad she got a permit for a short visit to Poland. So on the way there she stayed with us for a while as a guest, and she went to Poland, and then she came back, and somehow they decided to get married. In a way I was glad, because I felt sort of responsible to keep my father company all the time and not being able to go out with my friends and to the movies. So I was glad that he got married. He told my uncle once that he got married so I should have a mother. She was never a mother to me. She never had any children before. She never was married. She didn't know how to be a mother. I kept running the household and doing the wash and the ironing and preparing my father if he needed to go on a trip, and I did the shopping, which was an impossible situation because, again, there was nothing to eat and everything was on rations. I had to stay in queues, in lines for bread, milk, whatever. And then there was rumbling in the Czech government about a communist takeover, and my father decided that he had enough of 6 years under Russia, that it's time to move on.
Just before we go on, what was his new wife's name?
Sarah Forshim.
And when did they get married?
They got married in around 48. Before 47, 48, before we went away. So my father approached the subject to me about moving, and he wanted to go to Israel, as he always wanted to before Palestine yet, but I wanted to go to America. My idea of Palestine was hard work, very hot, very removed as a child. My idea of Palestine as a child was that it's at the end of the world, and after Palestine, that's where all the garbage goes. That's how far I thought Palestine was. Later on, I realized, how wrong I was about that, but I still thought that it was too hard. After 6 hard years of fighting to stay alive, I didn't feel like fighting again. So I prevailed upon him that we should go to America, which he agreed, and we applied, and the Polish quota, even though we were in Czechoslovakia, was tremendously long. It would take years, and I did not agree to go to Germany, to a DP camp, to wait. From there we could have gone sooner, but I wasn't going to go on German soil. So when we found out that it's going to take many years to go to America, my father said, okay, I'll send you as a student, and I will wait here till our turn comes. And we applied for a student visa. We got papers from New York, from a Jewish school for girls. And when I went to apply for the visa, the consul had a very good memory, and he went to the file and pulled out our name, that we applied to emigrate. And he said, well, I can't give you a student visa because if you apply to emigrate, that means you will never come back. And then we decided to go to Palestine. So I volunteered to the army. They were recruiting in Carlsbad, even women, to the Palestine-Israeli army. And I volunteered, and we were taken to a Czech army village where they really trained the Czech army. And we were there for 2 months being trained in the Czech language, which was useless when we got to Israel, because all the orders were in Hebrew. But whilst we were living in Carlsbad, my uncle Ian, who was working in Warsaw, decided to defect because the communists also were starting to take power there. And he came once to visit us. He got a permit to come to Carlsbad because Carlsbad was espoused the healing waters. He got the permit to come once. He came, he stayed with us for a while. He went back to Warsaw, and then he applied again. And because he went once and he came back, they gave him another permit, but this time he decided never to go back. So he stayed with us for a while. His wife smuggled herself out through Szczecin, which was a city on the border. One side was Polish Szczecin, one side was Czech Szczecin. There was a bridge dividing the city, and she smuggled herself across that bridge, and the two of them ran away to Paris, stayed there for a while, and then moved to London, England, where my aunt had a brother living in Newcastle on Tyne. So when my army training was over, we were going to be shipped by an Italian boat, Caserta, from Napoli to Haifa. And from Prague to Napoli, we were going to go by train. But that time the war was on, and the war was still on, and his wife decided not to go as long as the war is on. So my father decided to go with me and leave her in Carlsbad, and she would follow us when the war was over. So we took the train. It took 4 days from Prague to go to Napoli, because somewhere in Vienna the train was stopped for a whole day. The Jewish organizations tried to put illegals on the train, and they kept counting us, and we kept running from one end of the train to another to confuse them. It took hours till they gave up, I think, and they let us go. We boarded the ship Caserta, which was a freighter turned into a passenger with bunk beds. It was a terrible crossing, even though it was only the Mediterranean, but it was quite stormy. I was quite sick. And we arrived in Haifa, and I was taken right away to the army to Sarafent. There was a training center, and my father went to town. He had a bit of a problem with the immigration because his Hebrew was better than theirs, and they didn't want to believe that he was an Oleh Hadash, because Oleh Hadash supposedly had some kind of privileges, which was like 7 pounds and a cot. That was the privileges we got, not like now. And we were retrained in Sarafent to Hebrew orders, marching and so forth. And then we were divided into different camps. I was sent to Teletvinsky, where was an army hospital, and I was working as a nurse's aide. So all the boys with amputated arms and legs, and I would go out and throw up and come back and tend to them. And
how did it feel to leave Europe?
Didn't feel badly. My experiences in Europe were so bad that the further I went away, especially I was with my father, nothing mattered. Wherever we would have gone, I wouldn't have minded. And he explained to me, he told me a lot about his life in Russia, how disorganized and terrible the system is, and if we would have to live under that system, it would have been terrible. So I really didn't mind leaving Europe. And many of my friends left. Most of my friends that I was keeping company with in Carlsbad left. Most of them to Palestine. So it was like taking my new family and moving.
How long were you in the Israeli army?
First, I didn't want to accept me because they tested my hearing and my hearing wasn't perfect. So I had to sign on my own cognizance that I'm taking responsibility. If something happens to me, that it's my responsibility. So they accepted me. And then I didn't know that I have an ulcer. I suffered terrible pains, and the food in the army was not exactly the diet that's prescribed for ulcers. And I was really suffering working in the hospital with constant pain. I couldn't sleep. And I applied for a discharge. Once you're in, you cannot get out that easy. So I had to go through all kinds of tests and x-rays and more tests and interviews. And then I think that I went on strike. I didn't go to work. I stayed in bed. And I was sent to a lady because they didn't believe me. They thought I just want to go out. I went to a lady doctor who found my ulcer, and once she presented them with the x-rays, I was discharged. In the meantime, my father's wife came, and my father got a job with Kupat Cholim, which was the health care like OHIP in Canada, in Israel. And they bought a flat. And only years later, I realized that my father had a daughter, but they bought a one-bedroom flat. So when I had a day off from the army or wherever later, there wasn't room for me anywhere. They had to pull a cot into the dining room for me to sleep. And that means that there was no more permanence for me in my father's household, which I didn't realize at that time till a few years later. So when I was discharged, I had to think of what I'm going to do with my life. And my father suggested that Kupat Cholim has many, many hospitals and convalescent homes, and they always need managers, kitchen managers or household managers or dietitians. And I agreed to take a very concentrated course for a dietitian. It's called Menahelet Mitbach, a manager of the kitchen. And then when I finished, I had a job secured. So this is what I did. I enrolled in the hospital Beilinson. We lived on the premises, and we studied for 6 days a week, all in Hebrew, which my Hebrew was very limited because the lessons I took at home were very simple words and simple sentences. But at the same time, we also had lessons in Hebrew and in English, and of course anything to do with the future job. I was lucky to sit next to a Sabra, an Israeli born, who was a lefty. So she was writing right next to me here, and I could copy her spellings, and slowly I sort of got to the Hebrew language, and at the end of the 4 years I spoke it quite well. After the 6 months we had exams, which I passed, and I was assigned to a job in Shevet Zion.
How long did you live in Israel?
Total 4 years, from end of 1948 to March 53.
And what was the decision to leave? Like, how did that come about?
Well, I got married. Whilst I was training to become a Menahelet Midbach, I met my husband, who was in the Czech army. He was the liaison between the Israeli government and the Czech brigades, because there were many of us that came over. Ours wasn't the only shipment. There were many officers and soldiers that were in the English army, in the Russian army, that moved to Israel, and there were a few boats coming over, and he was, because he spoke Czech and Hebrew, he was sort of like a liaison. And I met him through a friend. He was married at the time, but sort of separated. And as a matter of fact, he was going out with my friend. And then somehow we started going out, and we got married in 1952. He had a building company together with his father called Avben. And it was very, very hard to do any business because there were no materials, there was no concrete, there was no steel, there was really nothing. There was a Solel Bonnet company in Israel who got all the priority materials that came to the country. And he sort of got fed up and decided to move to Canada.
What's his name?
Ernest Robert.
And did he go through the war?
No, he and his mother and his brother came to Palestine. She bought a capitalist certificate for 1,000 British pounds, and the British let you in the country if you had enough money to support yourself. So in 39-40 he came with his mother and his brother to Palestine. His father, the parents were divorced when he was around 12-13. His father could have come to Palestine also, but he had 2 old parents and he didn't want to leave them. So he stayed. He went through Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, but he came back, remarried, had a child, brought his mother back from Theresienstadt. His father died there. And he came also in 1953 to Palestine.
Okay. And how did you choose Canada?
How we chose Canada is my husband had a bookkeeper who was from Czechoslovakia, who knew my father-in-law, and that's how he was hired. And they decided to leave for Canada, and it was very hard to get to Canada at that time. You either had to have a relative or to go on a farm. And this gentleman, Mr. and Mrs. Silber, went to Saskatchewan for 6 months. After 6 months, they were allowed to leave. That was the contract, 6 months on a farm. They came to Montreal.
Could you just stop for a moment, please?